Is anybody watching? Okay, so I'm not sure what's. I'm going to start with Tehillim. And we'll start with Kapitel Tehillim. Kapitel Chaf. You know the background, the kollel, whatever. Yeah. So it kind of distorts. Well, yeah. So like I was watching the shir from Sukkot.
Yeah.
It would be nice to see the sukkah, you know.
Right. So
Whatever. That's all right.
I'm taking it away.
You don't have to. No, now it doesn't matter. So if you want it on the recording, it's fine. Okay.
Muktzah means my David.
Mizmal David. Yan Chadim Biyin Tzara Yisagel Chashem Eleh Yaakov Yishlach Ezecha Mikedesh Umitzion Yisadecha Yizkor Kol Min Chesecha V'Elaz Hayidash Nasela Yitein Lecha Chilva V'Cha V'Chol Atzoscha Yomachlei Nirani Na B'Shuasecha V'Shem Eleheit No Nidgel Yimale Adinoi Kol Mishal Leisecha Ata Yodaiti Kishi Adani Mishicha Yane Yom Mishmei Kachai. Before I say Isha Yemini Ela Baranfavi Ela Vasos Imanach to Beshem Adinoi Elihein Naskir Heim Alkorovin of Alovanach no Kaun of Anisedod Adinoi Heishi Yahamelach Yanei no Vigame Korei no. I saw yesterday a clip from a Sikha that the Rabbi spoke after Mincha, where where the Rabbi began that there was rumor or whatever idea was notified about a potential pending threat, whatever, and the Rebbe said to add in Stucca, add in learning. So we did Stucca. We also the Rebbe said about saying Kapitlach Tilim, and interestingly, I haven't heard this ever before. But the Rebbe said to also include the last Perek of Tehillim, Kufnun. Then the Rebbe emphasized that ends with Kol HaNeshama Tahallel Kol Hallelujah. Hallelujah, 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 Beki Yauzay, Hallelujah, Big Vore, Sav Hallelujah, Kerei Gudley, Hallelujah, Beseka Shefar, Hallelujah, Benevel Bechinor, Hallelujah, Besefa Machal, Hallelujah, Bemina Bogav. Hallelujah, betziltzalei shama, hallelujah, betziltzalei sruah, hanishama, hallelujah, hallelujah. Okay, so good morning. It is Shabbos, Erev Shabbos Bereishis. The simple reason why it's referred to as Shabbos Bereishis is because this is the Shabbos that we begin the Seder of learning of the Kriya of the reading of the Torah in Shul, which of course begins with Parshas Bereishis. So that's the simple reason why it's called Shabbos Bereishis. But Shabbos Bereishis, the fact that it's called Bereishis, which means at the beginning, it's also a beginning, not only at the beginning of the Torah, right? It says Bereishis not because it's the beginning of the Torah, it's because it's the record of the beginning of the creation of the world. But when we call it Shabbos Bereishis, what we're reminded of is that it's the beginning of a new cycle, and it's corresponds with kind of like the beginning of the new year. Now, of course, the new year begins with Rosh Hashanah, right? But Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot is all really like one big holiday. So now that we finally finished celebrating last Shabbos and Sunday, Shuvin Atzeres and Simchas Torah, we are now going back to the regular norms of life. until Eretz Hashem next year. That is the minhag in Chabad. Is that I think it's brought in Hayom Yom. Is that after Simchas Torah, we announce Yaakov halach ladarkei, and Yaakov went on his way, right? Meaning that now it's time to take all of the inspiration and all the chayus that we got over the Yom Tov season and begin, as the Rebbe would say, to begin to unpack the pekalach. We Baruch Hashem, we got many pekalach of Heiligkeit and Ruchnius and Kedusha, and now it's time to take those pekalach and start taking them apart and beginning to take advantage of them in our daily avodah, in our daily routine. So, Shabbos Bereishis is also the famous word that Chassidim would say, Shabbos Bereishis, the way we establish ourselves for Shabbos Bereishis, that'll be a good indicator of how the rest of all the Shabbosim of that year will go. Well, it is called Shabbos Bereishis, meaning that it's Shabbos. And Shabbos, we're going to do a very different kind of shir today, because it's a topic which unfortunately is very well known, but also very well unknown. Okay. So one of the most common terms, every child from when they begin to speak, right, brought up in a home where they observe Shabbos every week, is familiar with a term called Muktzah, right? The term Muktzah. Every child. Now, what's it based on? It's based on the fact that Shabbos is unique because on Shabbos we refrain from doing certain things, right? And to a child, that special behavior that we engage in on Shabbos, more specific, besides the Kiddush and the Suda and the going to Shul and the special davening, the refraining from doing certain activities is a very fundamental thing from a very young age, right? That's how they identify Shabbos. And the word that's used by a child for anything that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos is what, Rabbi Pinchas? Muktzah. Oh, it's Muktzah. You can't turn on the light. It's Muktzah. Now, this is a misunderstanding. So I'm going to go back to a few fundamentals, which you probably already know. And that is that on Shabbos, we have a mitzvah d'oraisa. The Torah commands us on Shabbos. It's actually both a asay and both a lois asay of lishbais. And to loy laseis b'lacha. Not to do malacha, to rest. They mean the same thing. One is expressed as an asay, rest. The other is expressed as a lois asay. There's absolutely no difference between the lois asay and the asay, practically speaking, in its application. It means there are 39 categories of productive activity, right? Malacha, it's called, that are prohibited on Shabbos. That's mid'oraisa. Now this has all kinds of branches and all kinds of extensions, etc., etc., etc. But most basically and fundamentally, we have 39 classes of activity that are prohibited to be done on Shabbos, and that is all mid'oraisa. The Torah does not specify them. It's interestingly, there are only two that are actually specified in the Torah. One is leisavaru eish, making a fire, so that's one. And the other one is al hayetzi ish b'pesach beisei, about not carrying in a rishus harabim. These are the only two that are actually specified in the Torah. The other 37 we learn from Torah Shabbat Peh, but it has the force of a Torah law. It is mid'oraisa. Okay, I'll just mention because mid'oraisa, Shabbos basically has 3 mitzvahs for every person to do for all times. Besides, the special carbon, basically, generally Shabbos for all people. That is the refraining from work, which is 2 mitzvahs, because it's expressed in the Torah both as a lois asay and an asay, which just as a footnote, we say there are 613 mitzvahs. But the reason why they're called 613 is not because there are 613 individual things. Some of them are actually the same thing, but they happen to be considered as 2 mitzvahs because the Torah expresses it as both an asay and a lois asay. To rest, refrain, do not work. Okay? There's relevance to that. That's not just, to make a point. There's relevance to that because the way halacha works, halacha treats in certain special circumstances, halacha treats an asay and a lois asay differently. Okay? But practically speaking, it's really one thing. The third mitzvah, interestingly, is Zacher es Yom HaShabbos L'Katchei. You remember Yom HaShabbos L'Katchei. So one time in the Aseret HaDibros, it says Shomer es Yom HaShabbos L'Katchei. That's a reference to the Isser Melacha. When it says Zacher es Yom HaShabbos L'Katchei, it's a reference to a special mitzvah saseh that applies on Shabbos, and that is L'Kadesh. When we make Kiddush, we are being a kind of mitzvah Zacher es Yom HaShabbos L'Katchei. Now, technically, mid'oraisa, it doesn't have to be the whole performance of the Kiddush as we do it, right? Over a cup of wine. In order to be Mekayim that mitzvah, the Eraisa, as the Rambam says at the very beginning, that it is to verbalize, to articulate, to mention the Kedusha of Shabbos. We are technically already yoytze that mitzvah when we daven Ma'ariv and we mention the Kedusha of Shabbos Shvon Esrei. We've already kind of mitzvah b'daraisa. The Chachamim, and this is something common with mitzvahs that are somewhat vague in their performance, because it doesn't seem to be a very concrete act to just acknowledge something and to mention it verbally. So in those mitzvahs, we often find that the Chachamim instituted that it should be done in conjunction with something more tangible. Okay, so the Chachamim said that it should be done over a cup of wine, where you make a very priagafen and you actually drink the wine, right? But that's really just an addition to the basic mitzvah from the Chachamim. So here we have another mitzvah, and that's the mitzvah of Kiddush Hayay. Because I mentioned that, I want to bring out something that actually has a practical application, right? Being that the mitzvah d'oraisa is just to mention the Kedusha of Shabbos, so there's a famous incident that took place, and I think it was with the Chassam Sofer or Rabbi Kiva Eger. I'm not sure who it was, but there's a little bit of a complicated issue in halacha, and that is that there are certain mitzvahs, right, that somebody could do on behalf of someone else. They could be mitzi them with a mitzvah. Now, it doesn't mean that the other person has no involvement. He has to have some involvement, right? When you're dealing with what's called a mitzvah shabigufay, a mitzvah that has to be done bodily, as opposed to, for example, a mezuzah on your house. You don't have to put the mezuzah on your house. There has to be a mezuzah on your house. Someone else could put that mezuzah on your house, and you are completely now exempt from that obligation. You had no involvement at all. Somebody did it, you didn't even know they did it, right? They voluntarily went, they saw you didn't have a mezuzah, they put up a mezuzah for you, you were in a different country. You come home, the mezuzah is there, your obligation is completely 100% covered. That's because it's not a mitzvah shabigufay. It's not a mitzvah the Torah says you have to do something, right? Your body. On Sukkah, you have to sit in a Sukkah. On Pesach, you have to eat matzah. Every morning, you have to put on tefillin, right? That's what's called a mitzvah shabigufay, a mitzvah that you have to do with your body. Now, Kiddush is a mitzvah shabigufay, because you have to articulate and you have to say the words that acknowledge the Kedusha of Shabbos. Okay? Or the mitzvah shabigufay. But even with the mitzvah shabigufay, there are certain mitzvahs where someone else could be, might see you. They could perform the mitzvah on your behalf so to speak, because it's not totally on your behalf. You're actually going to be involved, as you'll soon hear, right? And you're yaitze. Yaitze means, well, it's a very familiar term. Oh, well, you're yaitze, yeah. Well, I'll be mitze you. What does that mean? It means very simple. You have an obligation. As long as you haven't done it, you have that obligation upon you. When you're a yaitze, that means you went out of the obligation. That's all it means. So somebody can take you out of that obligation. How could that be done? If somebody makes Kiddush and they have you in mind, they could be mitzi you.
But that used to say a frugal Yid is actually really a friar Yid, because he did say all from the middle.
Now he's free. He went out of all the mitzvahs. He went out of the obligation.
He's always friar.
Yeah. So I want to tell you why you're never fry. You'll soon hear why you're never fry. Okay, you're never free. It's very interesting halach. You might not even get to this sheet of paper over here. We'll save it for next week. It's a very interesting halacha. You'll soon hear. So let's finish what we started. Now, how you might see someone in the mitzvah of Kiddush? It's a mitzvah shebegufa. You have to do it. You have to acknowledge, because there's a rule in halacha, shomeya ke'oineh. If I'm actively listening, right? And there are two conditions. The person who's saying it has to have you in mind, and you have to have in mind to be yaitze, that you're meeting your obligation by listening. That's considered as if you actually repeated the words after him. You don't have to repeat them. You're listening to every single word. And that's why it's important that you hear every word. And that's why you do not say Baruch Hu Baruch Shemai when you're being yaitze, because Baruch Hu Baruch Shemai would be as if you just interrupted your own listening. Your listening was as if you were saying it. So while you're saying it, you just interrupted yourself, so to speak, right? So that's how a mitzvah shebegufa, such as Kiddush, can also be done by someone else, and you are yaitze, you've gone out of your obligation, so to speak, right? You're now exempt from that mitzvah.
When the rabbi Shabbos, rabbi or someone else is going to make Kiddush wherever it is, he just said, I have in mind.
Everybody.
That's all he has to do.
He has to have in mind that he's being mitzi. He doesn't have to have this specific person in mind. He just has to be in mind that he's being mitzi, anybody who's listening who wants to be mitzi. Right. If he's doing it and he doesn't know that anybody is listening, and he's doing it because he wants to make Kiddush, and somebody happened to be standing there and listened, they're not yaitze because he didn't know that he did not have the kavanah of being mitzi. I think it's ma'akiv. I think that the kavanah to be mitzi, to take the someone else's well, exempt them from the obligation, right? Because it's considered like they did the mitzvah. There has to be that kavanah. There has to be that intention. Okay. There was a shayla in halacha. This is why it's detailed, it's a little complicated. In halacha, if someone already did the mitzvah, right? Okay. If someone already did the mitzvah, can there be mercy someone else who has not yet done the mitzvah? Now, the reason why it's a question is because in order to be mitzi, the person doing the mitzvah has to be as obligated as the person that they're doing the mitzvah on behalf of. So say a katan, for example, also has some kind of an obligation, but his obligation is chinuch. That's less than the obligation of someone who's bar mitzvah, or in the case of Kiddush, bas mitzvah, because Kiddush applies to women equally to men, right? Could the katan make Kiddush on behalf of his mother or sister or anyone? And the answer is no, because he's not as obligated as they are. So the person saying it has to be as obligated. Listen to a geshmake halacha. Now, when it comes though so what about someone who's already done the mitzvah? You would think he's not obligated anymore. How can he be mitzvah someone else, right? And the answer is because Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, all Jews are obligated for another, right? Being that every Jew is obligated for another Jew, even though you did the mitzvah, you still have that obligation for the other Jew who has not yet done the mitzvah. So you're have not actually been yotze completely. You're never yotze, so you're never a fryer yid. Because you may have done the mitzvah, but as long as there's another yid that didn't do the mitzvah, you are not completely, totally out of your obligation. If you meet that person and you know that they didn't do the mitzvah, you have an obligation to help them do the mitzvah.
There's no such thing as a fryer.
No such thing as a fryer. Even a frummy yid can't be a fryer yid. Right? No such thing. Because you're always high. So that's why the person who already did the mitzvah could actually do the mitzvah for someone else, right? But there's a little but over here. That is actually halachically not the preferred way. It's preferred that the person do it themselves. It's preferred that if you already did the mitzvah, you could be moitzi the other one. But if that, it should only be used when that other person cannot do the mitzvah. If they could do the mitzvah themselves, right, then it's preferred that they do the mitzvah, right? So somebody asked, and again, so I can never remember. It's like every time I tell this over, and then I check afterwards, and then I forget for the next time. It was either Rabbi Kiveger or the Chassam Sofer.
So she came from shul, you didn't make kiddush, and my wife hasn't heard it. It would be preferred that she make her own kiddush.
That was the question that the person asked. Either Rabbi Kiveger or the Chassam Sofer. They said, you were in shul, right? You davened already. And in davening, you mentioned the Kedusha of Shabbos. So you were already yotze the mitzvah d'oraisa, correct? You yotze the mitzvah d'oraisa. However, now when you come, but you weren't yet yotze the rabbanan. When you come home, your wife, she's chayeves d'oraisa, because she, let's say, didn't daven, right? So why? So wouldn't it be preferred that you make kiddush yourself? Because you have a lesser obligation. You only have the obligation of the rabbanan. And you're being mitzi, your wife, right, is being mitzi someone who has a higher obligation. So it could be done, but it should only be done with the evid. If she knows how to make kiddush herself, would it not be preferable to make kiddush herself? What did he answer? He said, 1 second, he said. She's not any more chayiv than you. Why do you assume that you're less chayiv? Because you already did the mitzvah when you davened, right? When you came home, did you say good Shabbos to your wife? He said, yeah. You said good Shabbos, yeah? Did she answer good Shabbos? Yes, she answered good Shabbos. When she answered good Shabbos, she acknowledged the Kedusha of Shabbos. So she was Yotze Deren. So now you still have to do it over a cup of wine in order to be Yotze Deren. Is that not a interesting halach? Very interesting.
How come they always say in shul, I get to bring whatever, say, if you look at the Havdalah here,
Okay.
then you should not make it in.
Okay, so Havdalah is a whole different story. Because there's a question whether the Nashim are Mechiyavis Bechlal and Havdalah. It's a machlekes whether Havdalah is part of the mitzvah of Kiddush, or it was a Chatchila only Derabanan. So it's a question whether the Nashim are Bechlal even Mechiyavis. So Havdalah is a whole different question. But now this issue, by the way, is really just an issue for Friday night primarily. Okay. Because you're going to have to repeat the beracha of the Kaddish Shabbos, and again, you should only do that with the Eved if the person doesn't know how to say it themselves. On Shabbos day, though, when you come home from shul, you're not saying any other special bracha other than the bracha Be'er Pri Hagafen. You're chayav because you're not yotze with the Be'er Pri Hagafen that you made in shul. When you come home, you have to anyway make another Be'er Pri Hagafen if you're going to drink a cup of wine. So it's not even an issue Shabbos day. It's just an issue for if you're coming home to make it. It's an issue Friday night. Yeah. Anyway, so this is just an interesting halacha when it comes to the third of the three mitzvahs, the Reis of Shabbos, the mitzvah of Lekadesh Zoches Yom Shabbos Lekache. Yeah.
I'm thinking of a situation where we prefer the person said. I'll use an example for myself. The rabbi's going to make kiddush, and I come in there and I'm hard of hearing, a little hard of hearing. I don't hear the kiddush properly. I'm trying to think. I lost my thought. Okay.
So you make it yourself?
So then my son
Okay.
is gonna make his for his wife. Oh, that's it. That's it, I wasn't quite sure.
Uh-huh.
When my son makes it, he's gonna make it for him. I said, okay, keep me in mind.
Okay.
Okay, so should I say it myself? But I have to keep me in mind. He's gonna make.
No, he has to make Kiddush anyway. There would only be a problem if he already made Kiddush. But let's say he's making Kiddush anyway for his wife or for himself even, right?
For his wife.
Right.
Because he's.
Was he Yaitse Kiddush himself?
No, he wasn't.
Okay, so he's making Kiddush.
Would I be preferred?
No.
To say myself
No.
can be.
No, if he was already Yaitse, it might be preferred that he shouldn't, and then you should say it yourself. But if he was not even Yaitse, perfectly valid for him to make Kiddush, and you could be Yaitse, no problem. It's actually a little bit preferable because if it's questionable, if you think that you were Yaitse from the Rav, then you should dafke not make Kiddush and dafke find somebody that didn't make Kiddush yet, and right, because there will be a Sofik Bracha for you, right? Yeah.
You could
That's-
drink up a wine.
Well, not if you're already Yaitse. Okay, not if you're already Yaitse, you already made the bracha, so you can't go make a bracha for no need again, even over the cup of wine.
And truly, you're right there. Come home and have your meal.
When you come home, all right. You're thinking about in shul though, right? In shul, right? Yeah, where he was ready Yaitse. Okay. Yeah. There's another issue over here that maybe I'll mention. The this rule that you could make a bracha for someone else and they're Yaitse by Shemei Kaina, right? Only works by brachas which are called brachas hamitzvah. The brachas that are usually asher kiddushato b'mitzvah, right? So that's called a birchas hamitzvah. So being it's a birchas hamitzvah, you can make the bracha for someone else. There's more common kind of bracha, I guess, that we make all the time, every day. It's called birchas hananin. So when you make a bracha over food, or the Beir Pri Agafen is a birchas hananin. You make a bracha because you're about to benefit from something, right? In that case, the halacha is you cannot make the bracha for someone else unless you're also benefiting. Right? You're also benefiting. So if you're going to make a bracha, very priyagaf, and you have to be drinking the wine, and then they could be yaitz as well. But if you're not drinking the wine, right? By kiddush though. So what happens here? By kiddush, you're making kiddush. Even if you're being yaitz at the kiddush, right? Very often you could give the wine to someone else to drink. And so you're not even benefiting from the wine. So it works for the bracha of the mitzvah. How does it work for the bracha of Beir Pri Agafen? So here the halacha says that the Beir Pri Agafen of Kiddush is different than any other, because since the Chachamim were misakin to do the mitzvah, they instituted that when you do the mitzvah of Kiddush, it has to be done over a cup of wine, and you have to make a Beir Pri Agafen. So that Beir Pri Agafen is different. It's considered like the bracha of a mitzvah, like a mitzvah. That Beir Pri Agafen is different.
By night or by day?
Both times.
Both are the same.
Both times. Anyway, so that's the story. Oh, so the bottom line, a practical application, is I'm walking home from shul, right? And there's somebody walking towards me, right? And I know they happen to be Jewish. Like when I go out on Hobart, a lot of the people they're Russian Jews, and I know they're Jewish, right? If I invite them to come to my house for Kiddush, it's not very likely, right? How can you get them to be Mekayim? So based on this story of Rabbi Kiva Eger, or the Chasam, every time I'll have to say both of them. If you say Good Shabbos, and they answer to you Good Shabbos, what you've accomplished is not you were friendly, right? Which is nice in its own right. That's Bistaba Mitzvah too, right? But you help them be Mekayim without them even realizing it. You help them be Mekayim. Because when they said Good Shabbos, right? They were Yaitse, acknowledging the Kedusha of Shabbos. So that's just an interesting little thing that about Shabbos. Now, on these papers, as I began, on Shabbos, the other two mitzvahs of Lishbais, to rest, and to not do melacha, which means 39 melachas. And yet, what's very common, especially amongst kids and even adults, is that everything that you're prohibited for doing on Shabbos, Muktzah, you can't do it on the right, Muktzah, you can't drive in the car, Muktzah, everything is Muktzah. And that is a misunderstanding. And I want to tell you exactly what Muktzah is. And it's actually a little bit complicated, but Muktzah is not one of the 39 melachos. It's absolutely 100% not one of the 39 melachos. In addition to the 39 melachos, so each of these melachos have rabbinic restrictions that were attached to it, right? And then there are some things that are actually rabbinical restrictions on their own. And one of them is that on Shabbos, the Chachamim forbade us to handle certain objects. Okay? That's what Muktzah is all about. It's not about doing something, it's about handling things, just handling things. There are certain things that were restricted from handling on Shabbos. There are different degrees as to how prohibited it is to handle. Different degrees. And this is where there's a lot of complication, maybe, or confusion. People are not clear about this halach. The very beginning is to understand the terminology. Okay? Muktzah is not a reference to a prohibition. Muktzah is an adjective that describes an object. That's what the word Muktzah is. Muktzah is an adjective, and it describes different objects. The prohibition, however, is called Asur L'Taltel. There's a Isur L'Taltel. There's a prohibition. Taltel means to handle. There's a prohibition to handle different things. This prohibition of handling has different levels based on how much the adjective of Muktzah applies to the object. You following? How much does the adjective Muktzah apply to the object? That will determine how restricted we are from handling it.
So in essence, it's not a single one of the melachos.
It has nothing to do with the Lamites Malachos, except according to maybe some deists, that it's an extension of a Malach. In other words, there's some, I think even the Rishonim, that, for example, one of the reasons that the Chachamim instituted the prohibition of Muktzah is because if you handle, say, a pen, which is Muktzah, and therefore it is prohibited to handle on Shabbos, you may come to do an actual malacha, which is writing. Okay, it's not the basic reason, though. The basic reason is stated very clearly that it's because the Chachamim saw that if people will handle things freely on Shabbos, it will basically, there has the potential of diminishing the whole Shabbos spirit. Plain and simple. What's interesting is that this idea that the Chachamim institute Isurim, restrictions, right, has a special, when it comes to, especially by Shabbos, it has a special term. It's called Shvus. Means there's things that Chachamim told us to refrain from doing that the Torah does not tell us that we have to refrain from doing, right? Is actually one of, goes way, way back. Most restrictions, rabbinic restrictions, were by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah in the times of the second Beis HaMikdash. But there are some that go way, way back. So the Isur of handling things actually goes back to the times of David HaMelech. Okay? So David HaMelech of Beis Dinoi and his Beis Din, they were the first to institute these restrictions. It evolved over time, right? I think it was by Shlomo HaMelech and his Bezdin. I think they tweaked it or whatever. Okay. I'm not really familiar with exactly the details, but it has to do with why there are different degrees of this prohibition. Okay. So on the paper, if you're using the paper, the two lists, A and B, basically, A are the objects, and the word Muktzah describes the object, and B is to what degree is it prohibited to handle on Shabbos. Okay. So let's start with the word Muktzah. Muktzah means it's a mental, it's a word that has to do with a mental approach to something. Okay. When we say something is Muktzah, what we mean, it's like so like, oh, I don't even want to think about it. Right? That's what Muktzah means. Some people use the term disgusting for Muktzah. It's not what it literally means. Muktzah means you've like, whew, you put it out of your mind. That's what it literally means. I came up with another word. It's not the translation of the word Muktzah, but it's a very good word in this context. Muktzah means objects that are useless. That's the term. Useless. Useless as far as Shabbos. Again, that's not what the word means, but but that's what it is. Why is this like, whoa, Muktzah? Why is it on the edge? It's like in the edge of my mind. It's not. I have no real, connection to it because it's useless for me on Shabbos. So why is your pen described by the adjective of Muktzah? Because I don't write on Shabbos. If I don't write on Shabbos, it's out of my mind, right? It's useless. I can't write. It's useless. Okay. So let's start with the adjectives that describe objects. And being that they describe objects, they're going to be, there's actually zero means that it's complete, it is not useless at all. It's actually very useful. And that would be Oichel v'Sifrei Kodesh. There was never a restriction on these two items, food and holy books and Svarim. Those are not useless on Shabbos. You're never Muktzah. You never like, oh, I don't need these things for the next 24 hours. No, you need the food, especially on Shabbos where you have a mitzvah to have 3 sodas. And you need the Sifrei Kodesh because Shabbos is a holy day and you have to daven and learn and the Chumash and et cetera, right?
So the fact that these are always mutter is because I'm not tzedas or the covenant.
No, it's a state of existence. It's a reality. These are things that have absolutely total usefulness for you. There's nothing useless about them whatsoever.
Same thing, my clothes, same thing, my
okay, so hold on. It's not totally. Hold on. Okay. These things, as far as the prohibition of handling, no restriction at all. There's no restriction for food or tzvar. Okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump to number 3, the bottom of the thing, on the 4th thing in the column.
But if you do it fleishiks, then milchiks, you could still move it and touch it. And
yes. Right. Good. That's a good example. Good example. The fleishiks, so the milchiks is kind of useless to you, right? But it's not, because the prohibition of Muktzah never applied to food. If it's edible, it is no restriction.
Also, guests could come.
Yeah, well, okay, hold on, whatever. But it's basically, it doesn't even matter. Even if you're no guests, you're in the jungle, it doesn't matter. Food was never subjected to the Surim of Muktzah.
Unless it's in the refrigerator and the lights out.
Well, that's a side problem. That's a side problem.
That's the refrigerator.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to jump to the last. The last is a whole list of things. All of these things, they're generally in halacha, it's 5 different categories. And basically, these are 5 things that on Shabbos are completely useless to you on Shabbos. Totally, completely useless. The battery's running low, whatever. Okay. The first one, and it says it here in Hebrew, the first one is something that's not even a keli. A keli describes an object that has a use. It has a functioning use, right? That's what a keli means. The word keli means a functioning object. It has a function. Something that has no function is just muktzah. It's useless by its own definition. It has no function, so therefore it's useless, right? So let's say, for example, you go outside in the yard, there are rocks in the yard. They have no function, they're just there, sitting in the yard, right? You are not allowed to handle a rock on Shabbos. Done. It's a useless item. And there's no excuse for handling the rock. Now, it's possible to make that rock into a keli. Let's say you use that rock to hold open your door. Now, if that is indeed the case, and you started using the rock, or you had to have been before Shabbos established as a keli, then it's not in that category anymore. You took the rock and you made it into a keli, you made it useful, and now it's not that category anymore. But if you hadn't, finished. It's a useless, it's muktzah, you have no intention to use that thing on Shabbos, it's muktzah, it's useless, and you're not allowed to handle it at all.
I thought a rock was okay to drink.
Oh, right. Okay, Arak, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Instead of rock, I thought it was-
No, that's in the first category. That's food and drink, obviously. Okay. Now, the 1 and 2 covers things in the middle. Okay. And the reason why we have these different degrees is because the way the halacha of Muktzah evolved from the Bezdin of David to the Bezdin of Shlomo and onward. So they started off with a total restriction on everything, right? Except for Eichel and Sifrei Kodesh. And then they realized that they went a little bit too far, right? So they started retracting the prohibition for certain objects, but they didn't totally retract.
Same
Okay?
Bezdin.
No. I think it was the following
And
Bezdin.
you're allowed to detract from an earlier Bezdin?
You know what? I'm not sure exactly. I don't remember exactly how the evolution went. Okay, but that explains why there are degrees of how much the prohibition, because there was one prohibition covered everything except for Eichel, right? And then they really 1 second. It's took it a little bit too much. So the 2 different objects that are muktzah, but they're not so totally useless, right? I'm going backwards. Number 2 says keli shemalach isur. Things that are generally, it's a keli, it's a useful object, but it's not very useful on Shabbos. You know why it's not very useful on Shabbos? Because it's made to do something you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. So a hammer, for example, is made for building. You knock 2 pieces of wood together with a hammer and a nail, you did a malacha, an issur d'oraisa of baina. So it's a keli that was meant for something also in Shabbos, and therefore the adjective of useless applies to it, right? However, it's not totally useless because it also has other uses and things that are mutar on Shabbos. So let's say you want to use the hammer to hold the door open. There's nothing wrong with that. You're allowed to hold the door open, right? Now, it depends. If it's something that you would never use for anything else because it's expensive, right? It's a very delicate tool, and you'll only use it for what it was designed for, then it goes into one of the categories of number 3. And that would be the second one, chesaron kiss. It's useless to me on Shabbos because I'll only use it for what it was designed for. So let's take the example of a pen, right? There's a very cheap pen and there are very expensive pens. They're both meant for writing, right? So there are keli that's belachti le'isur. It's a keli that was meant for something that's prohibited on Shabbos. However, what's it called? A cheap pen, right? A big pen, whatever. You have an orange. You want to start the orange peel. You wouldn't hesitate to take the pen and start the orange peel, right? But let's say you had a gold-plated, very expensive pen that you got when you retired from your from the law office, right? You're not going to use it to peel an orange, right? So the cheap pen is something meant for doing something that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. It's not completely, totally restricted. The very expensive pen would be number 2 in column 3 across, and that would be chisar and kiss. If I use it for something other than what it was meant for, it's going to diminish its value. I'm going to ruin it, right? So that expensive pen can never be handled on Shabbos. The pen, that's a cheap pen I could use to start my range if I want to on Shabbos, right? But it also has restrictions. What's the restriction? The restriction is that if you're going to use it for what you want to use it for prying open the door, or for prying or starting your range, let's say, right? Or use the hammer to hold open the door, that's called the tzorich gufay. I need it because it has a use for me on Shabbos. Then you're allowed to use it. And that automatically always goes along with l'tzorich mikaymai. Anything you're allowed to use because it does have some use for you on Shabbos. So only if you're going to use it for that use, then you're permitted to handle it. Can also be moved if it's in your way. It's in the way. That's called tzorich mikaymai. It always goes together. Do you know when you can't handle it? Let's say you left it outside. You left this expensive on the table in the yard, and it's beginning to rain, and you worry that it's going to get ruined. Sorry, it's the highest level of muktzah, right? No. I'm sorry. We're talking about something that you would use, but you left it outside. I left the hammer outside. If I want to use it to prop the door, I could do it. But if I want to do it because it's raining and it's going to get rusted, sorry, that's called a tzorich Hatzvi-Bais. Can't move the hammer. Got to leave it where it is. And we're running out of time, and so we could say we finished this. Let's go up a level, and that's keli shebalachti leheter. Things that were meant to do things that were permissible on Shabbos. And you mentioned clothing. Clothing obviously are permissible on Shabbos. So therefore, clothing has a very low degree of how prohibited it is to handle, but not completely. So you're certainly allowed to use it to wear. That's called tzorich gufay.
Even without the labor.
You're even allowed to use your clothing. If it's on the bed and you want to go to sleep, you're allowed to move it, right? You're even allowed to move the clothing if you're left there on the porch and it's going to rain and it's going to get wet. That's called the tzorich hatzah. You're allowed. What restriction is there? Why isn't it the same as clothing and as food, right? Because you're not allowed to handle it shaloi l'tzorich klal for no reason whatsoever. It's for loy l'tzorich klal for no reason whatsoever. And people don't realize that. But if your clothing is on the back of the chair and you have absolutely no need for it, you're not putting it on and it's not in your way. There's a restriction of Isser Tiltal that applies to it on Shabbos. You should not handle it for no reason at all. And as a child, sometimes we'd be fidgeting with our fork or whatever. For no reason. Okay, you can make some excuses. First of all, there's some days that say that the kalim for food are the same thing as the food. Okay, so it has no restriction at all. Others say, well, fidgeting is important. It's psychologically, it's helping me, right? It's calming my nerves. Okay, but there is a prohibition on Shabbos of things that were actually very useful on Shabbos. They were meant to do things that you're allowed to do on Shabbos, and yet it still has some degree of restriction, right? Where you're not allowed. It's different than a keli that was made for Isser, because that you're not allowed to protect it unless you need it. In this case, you're allowed to protect your clothing if you left them outside and it's going to rain. But for no reason at all, you should not handle anything on Shabbos.
What's the difference?
What if you come home and your wife says, the clothes are not to hang your jacket on the chair.
So you could tell her, sorry, honey, but it's not l'tzorich gufay. You're not asking me to put it on. It's not in the way. And it's not getting ruined. Good question. I'll answer that question with the following tshuva from Rabbi Feinstein. Somebody left something like a very not Shabbos stick on the Shabbos table. Okay. Now, if it was something like that expensive pen that we used before, sorry, you have to leave it there for Shabbos. Their question is, what if it was a kevish malachte le'isur, right? And a kevish malachte le'isur, let's say not an expensive pen, right? A regular pen that you would use to open your orange, right? You are allowed to use it to open the orange, and then we said it always goes together with you're allowed to use it if it's in the way. I want to put something down and it's in my way. So not having it on the table Shabbos, is that considered tzarich mekayme, or your wife not liking your jacket hanging over the side of the chair, right? You know what Moshe answered?
This is the way.
No. Moshe said, you don't need the place where that pen is. There's plenty of room on the table, right? The covet of Shabbos is to leave it on the table. You want it off because it's not Shabbosnik. He says the greatest covet for Shabbos is leaving it on the table. You hear what how Moshe thinks? You would think that it's a Shabbosnik table and there's a whole thing of pens over here. I left the whole thing with all the pens, right? Oh, guests are coming. Here's these pens over here, right? I have plenty of room to put out the food. It's a big table, right? So can't say it's tzarich mekayme, right? But is it considered tzarich mekayme because I want that place to be free of the pens? Said Rabbi Feinstein, you explain to your guests that Shabbos is a holy day, and by these pens staying on the table, that's how we are sanctifying and honoring the Shabbos. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I hope you learned something today.
Yeah, thank you.
You mentioned
Mike, Moshe.